So first, we're going to talk about our continuing coverage of the death of Amillier Penn. That's, of course, as we've told you many times, the teenager who was shot and killed last summer in June. The case of the fellow teenager charged in his murder continued in court today. We did hear from several witnesses who testified. Our Kelly Lichter joins us now. Kelly, you were in the courtroom. I want to just kind of back up for a moment. If anyone is not familiar with the case of Amillier Penn, can you give us just sort of the small scoop there on what this case surrounds?
So Amillier Penn was a 15-year-old boy who last June 2024 was out from the court docs and from talking to GRPD. He was out playing football with friends, but that may be a contested fact, as we heard today during the preliminary hearing. But he was out on Umatilla Street Southeast in Grand Rapids when he was essentially gunned down in kind of the grassy lot where they were at, and it took a year for the Grand Rapids police to come forward and officially get someone charged in the case, and that is 17-year-old Cartiyae Pascal. They say that him and Amillier had some almost beef-like things, and unfortunately, they say that it came to, getting shot and coming to that gun.
And this is a story we followed very closely. We've heard from Amillier's dad, Corey, many times pleading with the community for someone to come out and admit or admit to knowing something about who did this. And ultimately, when the charges were announced against Cartiyae Pascal just this summer, this was a huge deal as something that many in the community had been waiting for, to learn who was responsible here. Obviously, he is innocent until proven guilty at this point. You were in court today, and we're going to hear from witnesses in a moment who testified. This is not, a whole bang-up trial at this point. Where are we in the case court-wise?
So preliminary hearings, sometimes they are waived, meaning they don't happen, is when there's an opportunity for witnesses to come in and for some evidence to be presented to kind of show, hey, there's a case here, we think it should be bound over, so just meaning kind of put from district court to circuit court. That's what the judge ruled today. Spoiler, this case will be going to circuit court, and we heard from a bunch of witnesses and saw evidence that the prosecution brought forward. And unlike a trial, there is a lower, field of
burden of proof.
Burden of proof, correct? Yeah, burden of proof that you need to show in order to, kind of get the ball rolling for more. So it's not like a trial where, the prosecution and defense are bringing out all the stops again. It's just kind of almost like bare minimum. All right, we have witnesses, we have evidence, we believe that this could go to trial if necessary.
Yeah, it's really kind of an introduction to what the case could bring in order to, again, establish that burden of proof. We heard from witnesses today, and several of those witnesses we are not showing on camera because that was requested in the courtroom out of fear of retaliation, which is a serious concern. We're also only identifying people by first name, at least some of those witnesses. So we're going to hear from one in a moment who goes by Ariana. Can you tell me a little bit about her, why she was called to testify today?
So she was in a car shortly after the murder took place, and she claims in her testimony that she heard that Pascal got his first body, and that's kind of, the slang term for he killed someone. And so she said that she sat with this information for many months, and it kind of ate her alive until she said she talked to her mom, said, should I come forward? She said she messaged Corey Penn, Amillier Penn's father, to, connect her with a detective so she could say and tell him what she knew in the case.
Yeah, so you're going to see that clip here. You won't see her, but you'll hear her voice and you'll hear her being questioned by the prosecution. Take a listen.
What made you decide to come forward?
I felt sick to my stomach for months knowing about it. Literally was losing sleep over it because, this 15-year-old just deserves justice. And it made me sick because what if that was my sibling, or it just made me sick to my stomach. And one day I woke up and seen his dad's post on Facebook, and I finally reached out.
And then you told the police the same story you told us.
Yes.
Okay, and so a little tricky to hear there. Sometimes court audio is tough, but she was just really testifying to the fact that she knew what had happened was really making her sick, making her uncomfortable, and then that's what she says eventually propelled her to reach out to Corey Penn and then speak to police about what she had experienced. As far as other compelling testimony today, any other highlights to point out of folks who spoke?
We heard from one bystander who was on the block actually waiting for her heroin dealer, which was a point that the defense really harked on throughout her testimony and also throughout the rest of the preliminary hearing. But she says she was on the block the day that Amillier Penn was killed, and she says that, you know, she knows that Pascal was the one who was there and shot him. But of course, you know, she was waiting on the block for a heroin dealer. She was 24 hours since her last, you know, hit of heroin. And so the defense questioned, you know, if you were high and you had been high for, you know, a certain amount of time before that, she'd been using for a couple years, you know, could you actually truly remember, you know, his, I think she pointed out the gold-rimmed glasses and the short dreads, like if you were high, and she said that she remembered, and, you know, she doesn't have some of the side effects that people would associate with heroin, so she remembered what she remembered, but it also took her quite a few months to come forward. So then again, it was, you know, if you were high, if it's been so many months, how can you remember these facts so clearly?
Yeah, questioning her credibility, which is what we often see. You know, how can you be credible to answer certain questions based on whatever your circumstances were? Okay, and I want to go back to just sort of the procedural stuff surrounding this. Where do we go from here? Basically, that burden of proof has been established, but for example, you know, the Christopher Scher trial that we saw, a very lengthy trial like that, that's not necessarily what's happening here. It could, but that's not a confirmed fact yet.
Correct. So now that it is moved to the circuit court, it's bound over is just a fancy word for moved to the circuit court. So from here we could see a trial. That is a possibility. That is how, you know, some cases go, but there's also sometimes, you know, a plea deal offered on the table. That is between the prosecution, what they decide, and then the defense counsel, the judge. There's a lot of people involved in that, but, you know, if a plea deal is offered, a plea deal is taken, then that avoids the whole entire jury trial.
Right.
You know, there have been times where people have moved to dismiss a case. You know, don't know necessarily if that could happen in this case, but that's always a possibility that the case is just dismissed when it's in circuit court. So really, yes, is the most logical next step a trial? Yes, but we don't know that for sure until really that day comes. And there's also people who take, you know, their plea deal offers up until the 11th hour, right? You know, hours before they're supposed to, you know, go into their jury trial. So really, again, until that day comes, until that jury is seated and they start opening arguments, really no saying, what the next step is.
And so do we have a court date at this point where a next step will be decided, or are we still waiting on that?
So like a lot of things in the court system, they take a little bit of time to move through. So right now we just kind of have to wait until the case now pops up in circuit court, which sometimes I've seen it happen, you know, the next day, sometimes it's been a couple of weeks. So until then, we really don't know. And then even when it gets bound over to circuit court, it's really just waiting on that next hearing, whatever that may be, status conference. Sometimes there's a circuit court arraignment, so there's a lot of, you know, fun court stuff that still needs to happen.
Okay. Any other big details that I didn't ask about that you want folks to know?
You know, all the evidence that was presented today, the witnesses that were presented today, isn't really reflective of, you know, if this goes to trial, these witnesses are going to take the stand, say the same things necessarily. They may remember more details. We had witnesses today who forgot some of the details in their statements that they gave to police during investigative subpoenas. So really, you know, a preliminary hearing is, you know, a rough outline of what we could see in trial, but not 100% certain.
Doesn't depict exactly what would happen. And I do think it's interesting that we heard a lot today about that delay in coming forward, because that's what we heard from Amillier Penn's dad, Corey, so many times was every time we interviewed him, we know someone knows something, please come forward, you know, please bring this to light. But it also sounds like from some of the testimony that we heard today that, you know, there was a lot of fear about coming forward, which, you know, of course, you know, that's a very natural human emotion too. And one
last thing I want to say is a kind of a big important part of this that I just seem to, you know, forget sitting here on the couch with you is that the first episode of All Access GRPD on Investigation Discovery was about Amillier Penn's case, you know, which was something that the defense brought up quite a lot during this preliminary hearing, saying, you know, where did you learn this information? Where did you see All Access GRPD? And, you know, some people on the stand did. There were also witnesses who came in from custody at the Kent County Jail, and they said that they watched the episode with Cartiyae Pascal when he was locked up for I believe at the time it was another charge that he's also facing for a different case.
Yeah.
And so the defense said in their closing statement today that, you know, because of this all-access GRPD investigation, people are just looking for their 15 minutes of fame, and they said that they got it today. So I'm sure, you know, as this goes, you know, through more court hearings, possibly to trial, that episode, the first episode of the GRPD show, is definitely going to be brought up quite a few more times.
I mean, I know that was a big talker for us just here in the newsroom because we learned some things or, you know, had questions about some things when that episode came out that we didn't previously know. So it's certainly something that, you know, provokes questions and thoughts and emotion from people in the community because it does take such a deep dive into big cases here in our community. Yeah. Okay, Callie, well, we know you will keep us posted, and when we see a next court date or, you know, whatever that looks like, you'll be there and you'll keep us informed. Thanks for the breakdown of everything.